Today we're going to be looking at the Egyptian pharaohs, and we're going to not be looking at necessarily how they fit into all of the various dynasties of Egypt. If you want to do a lot of reading, you can just go to Google and type in list of pharaohs or dynasties of Egypt, and you're going to get a list of a whole bunch of different dynasties. I'm not joking. There's like 19,000 different dynasties. Well, not really, more like 19. But still, there's all these different periods and these different kingdoms throughout Egyptian history that we just really don't have time to get into, and it's outside the scope of what we're doing right now in class. And if you're really interested in it, I don't know, maybe you should sign up for some classes when you get to college, or if you want to take, go look for information online, or if you want to sign up for an online class about Egypt, or if you have questions, I'm sure you could go to like the Houston Museum of Natural History and you can ask questions there, and they'll be able to give you, voluminous amounts of information concerning the pharaohs. But again, what we're interested in is their personal lives. How did they act as a person? How did what's going on around them affect them as a person? How does history remember them as a person? And why do we remember them that way as a person? What did they do? What didn't they do? What affected the way that we view them? And so as we go through our Egyptian pharaohs, it's what we're going to be looking at. Now what you have here are a couple of pictures. One is a picture of Pharaoh, right? You hear the word Pharaoh, this is what you think of. Turns out that the little garb with the shirtless skirt headdress thing wasn't always the way that Pharaoh looked. In fact, most pharaohs didn't actually dress like that. They may have been depicted that way. It may have been dress that was used in formal occasions or formal religious ceremonies, but Pharaoh didn't go around the house in a skirt and a hat. I mean, he wore clothes just like everybody else most of the time. The other thing that you have here, at least we think he wore clothes most of the time. I don't know, maybe not, but probably. The other thing you have here is this rock. You can see this chunk of rock. And what it is this is a list of the different dynasties or the different pharaohs that were from Egypt. And so you can notice that there's a great deal of the rock not there. What this does is this creates problems for us. Because when we're going back through history and we're trying to figure out who was a pharaoh, who wasn't a pharaoh, when were they a pharaoh, when weren't they a pharaoh, and this is what you have, these chunks of rocks that are broken up and they're not all there, you don't have a lot of good information about who the ancient pharaohs are. And while some people may not be willing to admit it, when you get people who are very honest or who love history and they're not afraid to say there's stuff that we don't know, when you ask experts, they'll tell you that the further back in history you go, the less we know. And the more uncertain that information is, especially when you're dealing with things recorded on chunks of stone that are broken up and missing, and in foreign languages drawn with pictures on rocks. And so what we're going to find is we're not going to have a lot of information about all the different pharaohs we're going to look at, but we're going to do the best with what we got. Interestingly enough, the most accurate list of Egyptian pharaohs, there's no mistakes in it, is found in the Bible. The Egyptian lists, they're incomplete. Some of them disagree. The lists created by other kings and other cultures from around the world, they're incomplete. They disagree. There's spelling errors. There's all kinds of things that throw their conclusions into question. But when you come to the lists of pharaohs that are talked about in the scriptures, or the kings that are talked about in the scriptures, the Bible's never wrong, not one time. And the lists there are completely preserved. If not names, at least times and events that can help us kind of look back through history and figure out who is Pharaoh when. And so it's kind of interesting that out of all the ancient sources we have, the most accurate one is the Bible. And so the next time somebody wants to say, oh, well, the Bible's not accurate, we can't learn anything from the Bible, just kind of bring stuff like this up. We don't even know who the pharaohs are in Egypt if it weren't for the things written in the Bible. We wouldn't have all kinds of information about ancient kings, about ancient Roman society, about ancient Israelite society, about Canaanite society, the Akkadians, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hittites. We wouldn't know anything about those people for certain unless the things in the Bible were there. In fact, the Bible has led us to many, many archaeological discoveries and historical discoveries because it's never wrong. Nothing has ever happened to ever show that the Bible's wrong. So when we're looking at these different pharaohs, these different lists of people, there is a source of information that can be trusted. It's the Bible. So the first pharaoh we're going to look at, his name is Narmer. You can remember it because it's like farmer, but with an N. Narmer. When you think about the very first pharaoh, you would think that it was somebody who was just amazingly awesome, and we have all kinds of information about him. I mean, he's the first one, right? It's kind of like George Washington being the first president. We have all kinds of information about George Washington. It's mostly anecdotal stories now, but like we know what he looks like, we know when he became president, we know how long he was president. He kind of set the precedent for the president. We see all kinds of things that are in our society still today because of what George Washington did as the president. And so we would think, or one might think, that the same thing would be true with Narmer, that everybody would be looking back to what did Narmer do. They have little bracelets in Egyptian. WDND, what did Narmer do? There you go. And so we might think that he is significant historically. Well, we don't have a lot of information about him. And again, going back to this idea of Egyptians carving things on rocks, most of what we know about Narmer comes from rocks. There are some things with his name on it floating around that aren't big, giant chunks of stone, but mostly that's what we've got. So when you look at this picture of Narmer in here, he would be this pharaoh shirtless hat guy with his skirt. He's right here with this funny hat. Now, normally when you think of Pharaoh, you don't think of a hat that looks like this. I mean, he doesn't look at all like King Tut. But when you look at his hat is significant because it's the very first time that we know of that what we call Upper and Lower Egypt are united together. And it's actually the opposite of the way it looks on the map. The map you go up, that's Lower Egypt. The map you go down, that's Upper Egypt. Because it's high, Upper Egypt is high, Lower Egypt is low, and so that's where they get their names. It's geographical, not mapical. And so what you see here, cartographical is the word you're looking for, but mapical sounds better. And so what you see here in these hats, if you look over on this image right here on the left, there's the white hat guy and the red hat guy. They were the kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, and they had different hats. And they liked to kill each other because of their different tastes in fashion. And so what happens, for a very long time, you have these two different regions in Egypt that are slowly uniting together. Egypt had city-states, just like most of the world throughout much of history. There are different cities that are almost like nations. They're ruled by a king. Well, in Egypt, these city-states began merging together into smaller, more expansive regions of people. And then they kind of merged into just two. And eventually these two would fight it out, and Narmer would be the winner. And so when Narmer was king, to show that he was king of Upper and Lower Egypt, he put their two hats together. And that's the thing he's wearing on his head right there, is the combined crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, as far as the little snaky thing on the front of the white one, we don't know if that was actually there or not. It shows up in some later pictures, but in a lot of the carvings, it's not there. Now, is it not there because it was too hard to carve, or is it not there because it wasn't part of the hat? It's probably not part of the hat originally. Or there may have been different dresses that you wore at different times. Who knows? But when you look at their hats, you can clearly see the white hat and the red hat here combined together from these two hats. And he did have this huge little doily thing whoop, coming out the front, because when you're Pharaoh, you can do what you want. Now, when it comes to knowing things about Narmer, like I said, there's not a lot written. We mostly have rocks. And the problem with writing things on rocks, or the problem with writing things in general, is that somebody can come behind you later and erase them, or they can get lost or broken or whatever. So because Narmer didn't sit down and write a diary, or carve a diary, maybe as the case may be, we don't have a lot of information about him except kind of what historians, contemporary historians to Narmer, decided to write down and record. And basically what that means is we have chunks of rock like this right here. This is called the Narmer palette. And what it is it's a piece of stone, and there's carving on the front and on the back. And on the back side of it, you can see over here, there's Narmer standing and he's looking over things, and he's got his little red hat on right there. And on the other side, it's after his conquest, he gets his red cap. And then over here on the other side, you have Pharaoh here with his white hat, and he's got a mace or a cudgel in his hand, and he's about to crack this guy on the skull and kill him. And so basically what history tells us, these different rocks, is that Narmer was a big meanie who hit people on the head and stole their hats. And that's what we're left with. This is Narmer, the hat thief. Now, he's not a hat thief, he's actually the Pharaoh, and this is a depiction of his conquest, and you can see some religious symbology here. There's these different stalks growing, and he's overlooking them, and there's Horus here up in the corner looking down on Narmer as he's victorious over his enemies and uniting Upper and Lower Egypt into the very first dynasty of Pharaoh. And so that's really what the rock is depicting, but that's it. I mean, we don't know anything really about his daily life, other than the fact that because this is the information we have from him, we can probably guess about what his life was like. He was probably somebody who was defined by war. Every day he was, until he was Pharaoh, he was fighting to become Pharaoh. And after he became Pharaoh, he would continue to fight to stay Pharaoh from people who thought he shouldn't be. It's very, very difficult to unite people together using war. It's much better to do it through peaceful means. A good example is the relationship between the United States and Britain and Canada and Britain. The United States left the British Empire using force. Right? There was a war. We call it the American Revolution. And actually, revolution means going back to the beginning. It's not this Marxist idea of blowing things up and getting what you want. The Americans wanted to go back to a more perfect form of government, and so they revolved, just like a circle turns. They had gone halfway, so they're at a bad government. They want to go all the way back to a good government, revolution, whoop, like a circle. And so the Americans got guns and shot the British, and the British got guns and shot the Americans. Everybody shooting each other, very unpleasant, stabbing each other, even worse. And eventually the British said, fine, keep it, we don't want it, we still have Canada. Well, years later, Canada decides it'd be really cool if we were our own country. And they, talk to England, and England talks to them, and they write letters back and forth. They kiss, send flowers, and ba-dum, now you have Canada. So what happens is Canada and England have a very close relationship. In fact, the monarch of England is still the monarch of Canada. It's its own country, but the queen right now, it's a queen. She is the sovereign, the monarch of Canada. She is the sovereign of Canada, and she's also the sovereign of England and Wales and Scotland and all the other things, even Australia. But Canada is separate, and they got their freedom, their distinctiveness, without fighting. They did it peacefully. And so now Canadians and British people like each other. They have a very good relationship. And Americans and British people typically don't really like each other. I mean, it's not like you can't be friends if you have a friend from England. It's just different because the people were separated by conflict, and then they're really going to be brought back together by conflict. And so war is a big part of the history between the U.S. and Britain. Well, that's going to be one of the problems that Narmer's going to face throughout his life, probably, is he's going to have these people who are together but not really. And that's why it's going to take the might of his army to keep things together. And so he's going to spend all of his time becoming Pharaoh and then staying Pharaoh. And that's what happens when you unite people together using violence rather than using something that's nice, like flowers. In addition to the things that we've talked about so far, you have this monkey over here. Apparently the Egyptians like monkeys. They made statues and worshipped them. And Narmer's name is on this one. So he is a hat thief who hits people on the head and likes monkeys. That's what the carvings tell us. I can't emphasize how important it is that you guys write diaries. Journals, whatever you want to call it. I don't know if people write diaries anymore. I don't write something down on paper that can be preserved. I would tell you to write a blog or something, but if your computer crashes or if the internet explodes one day, your blog is gone. Maybe you could blog and then print a paper copy and stick it somewhere. But what's happening is people aren't writing down anymore what happened during their daily life, and historians are afraid, or they fear, that in the future we might lose all that information. And so people aren't going to know, what did people in high school do in the United States in the early 21st century? If you don't write it down, then later people won't know. Because that's what we get history from. Unless people carve rocks of you stealing hats and hitting people on the heads and eating monkeys. Then they would have a misconception about what your life was like. It's so important to write things down. Can't stress that enough. Write it down. so that people will know what happened. That's how history gets remembered. Another interesting thing about Narmer, kind of gives us another insight into what his life would be like, is the name of his wife. Now, her real name was probably like Fanny or Deborah or something like that. But what would happen is, upon becoming king in the ancient world, you were often given a king name. And it was different than your real name, because nobody wants to worship King Josh. But if you have King Narmer, there you go. And so his wife's name is different probably than the name that her parents gave her, but his wife's name would be Nethotep. And Nethotep, Net is the ancient Greek, listen to that, ancient Egyptian goddess of war. Yeah, they have a goddess of war because women are very good at killing people. So the goddess of war was the name for his wife, Neth. And what happens is Nethotep means Neth is satisfied. So the goddess of war was satisfied finally when Narmer was able to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. He got done killing people, crushing them on the head, stealing their hats, and now Egypt is united together and the goddess of war is satisfied. And so that kind of gives us this idea, this concept that his entire life, I mean, he even named his wife after this, his entire life is about uniting Egypt and then keeping it united. That's probably what his life was all about, because it was born, his position is born from conflict, and it's going to stay in conflict throughout his reign probably, and probably the reigns of the next several pharaohs in this very first dynasty, until there is a unison of culture, or a fusion of cultures within Egypt, so that then there just becomes an Egyptian culture, which will eventually happen. The view of the afterlife at this point in time, when Narmer is pharaoh, is in flux because he's not buried in any kind of great tomb. You know, there's not a giant pyramid, there's not a Valley of the Kings, there's not any of those things yet. And so a lot of the mythology around Pharaoh, where Pharaoh is the one who makes the sun rise in the morning, he goes through the underworld and he battles things and he has to make sure that the sun rises. That's probably not in place yet. Was there a belief in some kind of an afterlife? Probably. How extensive is it at this point? We don't know, because he's not buried with all kinds of stuff like we'll see with later pharaohs. I mean, don't get me wrong. He's got stuff in his tomb, or there were things in his tomb, but not like the later pharaohs. And so this kind of gives us a view that Egyptian religion is in flux. And it will continue to be in flux throughout the time that Egypt is a major world player, throughout the time that Egyptian religion is in place, the Egyptian mythology. And so what we're going to see is religions change. And because religions change, different people will do different things at various times based on their belief in the religion. Everything in Egypt at this point in time is not focused on the pharaoh. Later it will be. Everything will be done surrounding the pharaoh's role in making the sun rise. The religion will become the centerpiece of Egyptian society later, but it's probably not at this point. And that's another interesting thing, is that while religions often change, God does not. And so when we look again at the Bible and we see this God who doesn't change, that's the God that we need to be looking for, not these religions that are constantly in flux. And there are even versions of religions that try to worship the God in the Bible that are constantly changing. If your religion is constantly changing, and it's got all these different sources of authority and all these different things that are constantly moving and shifting, that's a big key or a big indicator that you've got people guiding something and not God guiding something. And so it's just another thing that's interesting. When you look through history, you can see these different changes. And so that's kind of Narmer's life. He was involved a little bit in Judea, a little bit in the Promised Land, Canaan. We have different shards of pottery with his name on it from those regions. And so the peak, actually, of Egyptian involvement in Canaan was during the time of Narmer. And this is, remember, around 3000 BC or so. And so this is a long time ago. This is very, very, very long ago, long before Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and all of those nice people. And so Egypt would have some influence over in that region. Many people think that Narmer actually invaded the region, and then later he came back and stopped. So that's kind of Narmer in a nutshell, and then we're going to move on to our next pharaoh. The next pharaoh we're going to look at is Djoser, or who I like to refer to as Dozer because it's easier to say. This guy is from the 3rd dynasty, around 2700 BC, and he was going to be Pharaoh, or he was Pharaoh, for around 30 years. In between Narmer and Dozer, there's going to be quite a few changes in the way that Pharaoh operates and how powerful he is and how he's viewed by the people. And so we've begun to see the solidification of this culture. There are some other things that are going to indicate that Egypt is becoming more unified. And Dozer is going to be somebody who makes changes to the way that Pharaoh lives to make those things more of a reality. For example, he'll be the first Pharaoh buried in Lower Egypt. All the other pharaohs up to him are buried in Abydos, which is in Upper Egypt. And so he's the very first Pharaoh to be buried in the Lower Kingdom, or what used to be the Lower Kingdom in Egypt. And so there are changes, political changes, social changes, and religious changes, as we'll see, that have been taking place from the 1st, 2nd, up to this now the 3rd dynasty. He is called, one thing that he's called is divine of body. And so when you think of Dozer, divine of body. Now whether that's referring to the fact that he was really cute, or if it's referring to the fact that he is divine, like the other pharaohs later definitely will think that they are divine, they are the sons of the gods, that may have been what this is referring to, where we're beginning to see the pharaohs worshipped as gods themselves, and as his monuments for his death will seem to certainly indicate that that's probably the case. The pharaohs are beginning to be viewed as gods, or at least gods in human bodies, rather than just people who happen to be the king, like Narmer was when he united Upper and Lower Egypt. So it's hard to tell. Is this referring to his physical appearance? Is it referring to his mythological status as a deity? We're not sure. But when you look over here at some of the carvings that we have about Dozer today, you can maybe notice in the top of this carving that some of the hieroglyphs that used to be there have been removed. It's hard to be the king. If people don't like you after you die, they'll come along and they'll steal your stuff, they'll try to erase you from history, or they'll do other things like that. For example, Dozer had at least 2 daughters, and we only know the name of one of them because the other one has been erased from history. The information that had her name on it has been destroyed. I don't know, maybe her older sister hated her, who knows, but somehow all that information is lost. And so we know that he probably had a 2nd daughter, but we don't know anything about her. We don't know her name, how old she was. We don't know any of those things because it's just been erased. And so that can happen even to pharaohs. People will come along and they'll edit things, or maybe you did something that was unpopular, or maybe the religion changes. Like maybe there's something where Dozer, admits, I'm not a god, I'm just a man. And later pharaohs come along and, now they got to fix that because they want to be gods and not men. And so that happens from time to time. He is going to be married to a woman by the name of Hetef-ernebti, and that means the one who sees Horus. Horus is going to be depicted throughout Egyptian religion and hieroglyphs as falcons, like here's falcons here. There's another one of those little monkey god things. And then you have this falcon up here, there's a falcon there. So Horus is very important to the pharaohs. He's going to be seen as a protector of the pharaohs, and he's going to be seen as the god of the sky, a very big god. He keeps the sky at various points in Egyptian mythology. It's going to be in flux, but that's kind of what he seems to be around this time. And he's very important to the pharaohs. He protects them. He keeps them safe. He's the one who gives them long, happy, healthy lives and gives them a protracted dynasty. He'll make sure they have that their kids will be protected and all that good stuff that you want when you're the king. Interesting thing about Hetef-ernebti is she is Dozer's sister. At the very least, his half-sister. And so what you're seeing in the Egyptian royalty, at the very least, is some really weird, odd family reunions. When everybody who comes to the family reunion is your brother or your sister, and they're also your aunt and your uncle and your cousin. And so it's weird. But imagine if you were going to be married to one of your brothers, and if you don't have a brother, imagine you had one and you were going to marry him. It'd be a little awkward. But that's kind of how it worked. You're beginning to see more of an exclusivity amongst Pharaoh and his court, where they're not going to interact so much with the common folk in Egypt. They're becoming a separate class entirely, where they're unworthy of mingling with the commoners. whereas Dozer, Narmer, seems to be much more of a people's pharaoh, where he's out battling on the field and doing all the things that the other people did. Now we're beginning to see the pharaohs kind of take a laissez-faire attitude to ruling, where they're going to kind of stay away from the common people. That's going to create a problem later when we begin to look at some of the other pharaohs with the religion, where the priests are going to start getting too much power. So Dozer begins to kind of separate himself. There's a kind of cool thing here in this picture. This is called a Hebsed celebration. Hebsed celebration. The Hebsed celebration is the a festival, basically, marking the continued reign of Pharaoh. It was done every year, and every year that the Pharaoh was alive again, they would have this Hebsed celebration. It was kind of thanking the gods for their protection, for keeping the Pharaoh alive, and apparently Dozer liked to run marathons at his Hebsed celebration. Well, not marathons, but he liked to run. That's kind of how he celebrated. So he was probably a very fit king. He's probably very strong, maybe that divine of body. I don't know, maybe he looked like Arnold or something like that. But he seems to be a very fit pharaoh, and again, you have the no shirt, skirt, hat combo going on there in the depictions. But he probably didn't actually dress that way. That's just kind of the way they are depicted in the hieroglyphs, these high religious pictorial images used to tell us about the pharaohs. Another cool thing about Dozer is he's the first Egyptian pharaoh to have a full life-size statue painted of himself. That's what this is here in the middle. This is a limestone statue. You can kind of still see the remnants of paint on it. But up until him, the pharaohs didn't do that. He's the very first guy to ever have a life-size statue painted of himself. And it's interesting. I've never thought that I would like to have a life-size statue of myself just chilling around the house, painted to look exactly like me. It'd be kind of creepy. But he did that. He's the divine of body, Pharaoh, and so, if you're handsome, why not have a statue of yourself to look at all day? Better than looking at anybody else, I suppose. And so that's kind of what's going on here with his statue. It's pretty neat. Another cool thing that Dozer did that's first is he built the very first pyramid. There it is in all its glory, the very first Egyptian pyramid. Now, if you notice, it's a little bit different than some of the other great pyramids that will come later at Giza. This is a step pyramid, and basically a step pyramid is you have a big square, and you put a smaller square on top of that, and a smaller square on top of that, and a smaller square on top of that, and then you do the little square dance, and then you wind up with the step pyramid. That's kind of what you got there. Dozer will be buried in that pyramid. Will have an entranceway or a passageway down into a burial, like a catacomb area with several different structures. And so the tombs of the pharaohs, this is the first pyramid, but the burial system or the burial rituals are becoming very complicated. And in these pyramids, or in this pyramid, you're going to see something that is called a serdab. This is the serdab right here, this hole in the wall. Apparently there's some kind of a chamber, and we're uncertain right now what the serdab was actually for. But we think perhaps in this room, it was the room where the pharaoh was buried, and there were other things in there with him. We think that his spirit kind of chilled out in this room, and the serdab allowed his spirit to leave, like to go wander around the earth or do whatever Egyptian spirits do when they die. It's also believed that people were allowed to stick food through there, so that if he ran out of food in the room, he could have new food put in there for him. It's kind of like the grave alarms that people used to put on in caskets in the 1800s, where people were afraid that you would die and not really be dead, and then if you woke up and you weren't dead, you could ring an alarm. And there were even latches in some of these things where family members could come by and they could put food down into your casket, yet you're underground and there's a hole, and they could open it up and drop food down in case you really weren't dead. I don't know why you'd want to stay in your coffin and eat, but whatever. So we think that maybe that's what this is. This serdab is kind of like that. It is also perhaps there so that Pharaoh, after he's dead, there's a place outside of the serdab, this hole in the wall, where people would worship, and they would burn incense or offer things to him. And perhaps it was there, we think, so that he could enjoy the offerings. He could smell the incense, he could see the people offering things, smell the meat, whatever. We think that that's kind of what's going on, perhaps, but nobody really knows. It's just kind of neat that you're seeing this complexity in the Egyptian religion beginning now. Pharaoh's not just a really nice guy with two hats who died. Now he is this divine person who is worthy of worship, who lives on after he dies, who needs things in this physical world so that he can accomplish things in the spiritual world. We're beginning to see, the basis for later Egyptian mythology forming now in this third dynasty. And it didn't take very long. If we're dealing with, 3100 BC, 3000 BC with Narmer, now we're only in 2700 BC, 2600 BC with Dozer, and already we have these complex things built up, these changes that are put in place. It just shows you how fast people change, how fast cultures change, how fast religion changes when there isn't some set of guidelines keeping things in place. There wasn't, God there, the Father, or wasn't there directing things. There's just people running around deciding what the religion will be like, and so it changes drastically from the beginning until this point. And so we're going to continue to see changes as we look at these different pharaohs. The next pharaoh is Pepi, Papi, however you want to say it. I like Pepe Le Pew. Anyway, Pepi the second. And the only reason why we're talking about him, he did a lot of interesting things. He's kind of the end of the old kingdom in Egypt. Again, if you want to know more about the different kingdoms and dynasties, just go to the internet and check that stuff out. Google, Wikipedia, you can just kind of get a brief understanding of the different kingdoms. With Pepi, you'll want to search for the Old Kingdom. He's one of the last pharaohs in the Old Kingdom. But the reason why we're talking about him, the things that make him cool, is he lived to be 100 years old. He was born around 2284 BC, died 2184 BC, 100 years old. So he was an old guy. We tend to think that people in the ancient world lived to be like 12. Well, that's not true. People lived to be old. In fact, many of them lived to be as old or older than people today. God has designed wonderful things in our bodies, and the bodies will live as long as they stay healthy. Pepi was healthy for a long time, 100 years long. Another cool thing about Pepi is that out of all the places that have ever had kings in the history of recorded history of the world, he is the longest reigning human monarch. And the reason why I say things like that, why I word it that way, the longest reigning human monarch, is because God is the longest reigning king. He has been the king from the beginning, before the beginning, and he will be the king after the end. So God is the longest reigning monarch, but Pepi as the longest reigning human monarch. He was king for about 94 years. He became pharaoh when he was 6. He lived to be 100. You do the math. 94 years he's king. He has the longest recorded reign out of any king or queen in the history of the world. How cool is that? Another thing that's neat about Pepi is that his name rocks. Who wouldn't want to be called Pepi? It's just neat. He's also the cutest pharaoh. He's one of the only pharaohs that we have. The cute little pharaoh right here. Oh, he's so adorable. Sitting on his mother's lap. So Pepi is the cute, cool, old pharaoh who has the longest reign in recorded history. The next pharaoh we're going to talk about is Hatshepsut. And she has the distinction of being the very first female pharaoh. Now, there were other females who were involved in ruling Egypt. For instance, Pepi's mother kind of acted as his vizier or advisor until he became old enough to begin making decisions by himself, because nobody in their right mind gives a 6-year-old a crown and says, here, go be king. They say, well, you're the king, but somebody who's older than you is going to rule until you're smart enough to make decisions for yourself that won't completely destroy the country. So Hatshepsut is not the first woman to be in power, but she is the first woman to actually be the pharaoh. And in some of the statues of her, you'll see her with a little, iconic pharaoh beard. It's kind of funny to think that there was a woman running around in ancient Egypt with a fake beard, but that's what you did when you were the pharaoh, whether you were male or female, because a lot of the men who were running around as pharaoh didn't actually have their own facial hair. Lots of times in religious ceremonies, especially with the priests and the pharaohs, all the hair of your body was shaved off. all of it. So there's no eyebrows, there's nothing. So there's no facial hair. So in order to have a beard, they had to strap on a fake beard to make them look like men. Well, Hatshepsut, being the pharaoh, also needed to look like a man, even though she was a woman. So it'd be really weird to see a chick running around, or excuse me, a lady running around with a fake beard, but there you go, that's what she had. So Hatshepsut is the pharaoh, has the distinction of being the pharaoh, or at the time she was Pharaoh's daughter, who drew Moses out of the Nile River. When you look at the chronology for the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, her father, whose name was Thutmose I, had a daughter named Hatshepsut. Now, what's interesting is you have Thutmose, and Hatshepsut draws Moses out of the river. You can kind of look down here. We have the little genealogy here. You have Amunhotep, who's going to have his son, Thutmose, who will have a daughter, Hatshepsut, and as well as a son, Thutmose II. And then Thutmose, over here with Iset, is going to have a son, Thutmose III. And Thutmose III will have a son, Amenemhat, who will die, and then Amenhotep II will be his second son. And so what's going on here is you have the chronology here that is, consistent with what we see in the Bible. There's a change that's taking place in the ruling class. The Hyksos were ruling before, and they're kind of ushered out. And there's a new ruling group coming in who will not be familiar with Jacob or Joseph and with all the things that he did to help Pharaoh, help Egypt. The Hyksos were shepherd rulers, and these new rulers are not. Well, what that means is it means that Thutmose I is the pharaoh who ordered all the Hebrew boys to be killed. And Hatshepsut, seeing Moses in the river, will draw him out, and she will adopt him as her son. She does not have a son with the king, Thutmose II. She will have a daughter with the king, and because there is a son who's involved, Thutmose III, with a rival queen, that's going to create some tension that we'll talk about in a little bit. But Hatshepsut is the daughter of Pharaoh who rescues Moses from the Nile River. Her father is the one who killed all the Hebrew babies, and her husband, her I guess, son-in-law, or half-son, or however that's going to work. It gets complicated when you have pharaohs married to multiple ladies and they have all these different kids. Anyway, the king who will come after her will be a rival to her son Moses. So there's going to be a lot of political intrigue going on. Well, she reigns for about 20 years as pharaoh in her own right, and she has mostly a peaceful reign. Except when people make her mad, then she kills them. It's kind of like Shakespeare talks about how there is no fury like a woman who has been scorned. Well, the same thing will be true with Hatshepsut. She's great until you make her mad, then you better watch out, she'll kill you. And so what's going to go on here is, while mostly her reign is peaceful, at the beginning she brings some thunder when it's time for Egypt to go to war. And maybe she has to do this to kind of prove that she can do all the same things that the male pharaohs can do. For whatever reason, throughout most of history, women are viewed as inferior to men. That's not true, and the Bible never portrays women as inferior to men. In fact, the Bible gives dignity to women that the ancient world doesn't. The Bible says that men and women are created equally before God. They have equal dignity before God. They're both equally valuable to God. They both are made in God's image. And so the Bible kind of lays it out there from the very beginning that we're equal before Him. Now, there are different roles when a man and woman are married and they begin a family. There are different roles that are outlined there. But as far as dignity and standing and equality, there's no question when it comes to the biblical account. But she has to prove herself in ancient Egypt, and so she does that by killing people. And then everybody says, oh yeah, you kill people just as good as men do. Congratulations, now you can be Pharaoh. So while the early part of her reign has this, warfare, is marked by warfare, the later part of her reign, once she kind of establishes herself as Pharaoh in her own right, will be marked by building. She's one of the most prolific builders in ancient Egypt. She builds more than anybody in what we call the Middle Kingdom. And again, if you want to know about those things, just go look them up on Google. And actually, if you want to know more about Hatshepsut, there's tons of information about her, and she's just amazing when it comes to the things that she can build, or that she had built. In fact, there is an entire section in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art that is dedicated just to the stuff that she built, to the art and the buildings that she had, and the sculptures and obelisks and all kinds of things. I mean, it's just phenomenal how much was produced under her reign. And so, she's culture. She brought a lot of culture to Egypt. She opened up new trade routes that had been closed to other pharaohs, and so she brought wealth to Egypt. She does a great job running the country. Now, when we get back to what's going on in the Bible, what she's doing when she wages war and then she begins to build all these things and open up these trade routes and does all these amazing things, she's working to gain ground that a male pharaoh wouldn't have to, but additionally she's working to secure the right of her son. Moses is her adopted son. Moses is an Egyptian name. Just kind of think about it, that the Hebrew deliverer has an Egyptian name. Anyway, Moses is an Egyptian name, and by legal right, he is the heir to the throne. So when we read through the Bible, it kind of seems like, oh, well, Moses is the adopted son. He wouldn't become the Pharaoh. No, that's not true. He was going to be Pharaoh. If he did not leave, he would have been Pharaoh. Hatshepsut is the Pharaoh. She wants her son to become Pharaoh. And so if Moses doesn't leave, he becomes Pharaoh. That kind of makes his giving up Egypt a lot more powerful. He didn't just give up being well known, he gave up being the king. He gave up being the king of the most powerful nation in the world, the wealthiest nation in the world, the most expansive nation in the world, in order to go join a bunch of slaves. That's incredible faith in God. And so Hatshepsut is fighting, because remember we mentioned earlier, her husband, Thutmose II, had another wife whose name was Iset. And Iset would give birth to Thutmose III, who is second in line to become Pharaoh, because Moses was the first son adopted and legally has the right to claim the throne. So what this means is that Hatshepsut's life is going to be full of political intrigue between herself and Iset, as they both position and jockey to kind of get their son set to take the throne. So Hatshepsut is spending her entire life getting her son ready to succeed her, to become the Pharaoh afterwards. Now, when Moses comes and turns to her and says, I don't want to be Pharaoh, I'm going to go hang out with the slaves, see you later, that makes her mad. Remember the queen who at the beginning of her reign killed everybody who made her mad? Okay, well now Moses made her mad. So she's probably going to be out to get him. And so Moses has to run away, not only to get away from Queen Iset and her son, Thutmose III, who will become Pharaoh, but now he has to get away from Hatshepsut and all the people that she's going to be sending after him to get him for turning his back on her after she's been going through all of this to make sure that he becomes Pharaoh. And so there's a lot of, like daytime soap opera drama going on here with these different pharaohs and who wants to be king and all that. And so when Moses leaves, it's a pretty big deal. And it's going to shake things up. And Thutmose III will wind up becoming Pharaoh. And because his mother was rival to Hatshepsut, and he was rival to Hatshepsut's son Moses, he's going to go through and he's going to have a lot of Hatshepsut's obelisks torn down, a lot of the art that she made torn down, a lot of the structures that she built torn down. He's going to go through royal records and carvings and walls, and he's going to have his people chisel out Hatshepsut's name. And so basically, kind of what you see is there's these rows of hieroglyphs, and then there's a Hatshepsut-shaped hole where they chiseled her name out. It would kind of be like, erasing somebody's name if they had written it in pen using whiteout, and instead of just putting a block of whiteout, you just trace the whiteout over their name, and so people could, tell exactly what was there. That's kind of what happened. And so it's neat to go back and read through some of the old hieroglyphics, and you can see, oh, here's Hatshepsut, we know, because the chisel mark is in exactly the shape of her name. So if you're ever going to blot anybody out from history, you have to do a better job than that. So anyway, Thutmose III becomes Pharaoh. Moses will come back later. Thutmose has a son. His name is Amenemhat. He is the firstborn in line to become Pharaoh. And then if you remember the 10th plague where the firstborn son dies. Interestingly enough, he dies. Thutmose, his son, dies, Amenemhat. And then Amenhotep II, who is the second born, will become Pharaoh. And so all of this fits in with the timeline of the Bible. You'll see every once in a while somebody will try to say that Ramesses was the king or pharaoh when Moses was there, but Ramesses is like 300 years too late, 200 years too late. And so when we look at the Bible and we look at ancient Egyptian chronology, they match because the Bible is right. The things that are recorded in the scriptures are correct. And they're verified by historical fact. They're verified by archaeological facts. And so we can see all these things. There's no question about these things. And it makes the lives of these pharaohs more interesting when we can go back and we can see how they fit in with the Bible and all of the intrigue and all of the crazy things that would be going on during their lives. Another cool thing about Hatshepsut, we didn't really talk about it yet, is you can see down here in this picture, there's this massive complex that's built where she's buried. There's these huge colonnades, and this picture's small, but this complex is gigantic. She did not build a pyramid, so to speak, but she did build a very massive complex, and she's buried inside it. Again, you know, she's the master builder of the Middle Kingdom, or at least the master planner of the Middle Kingdom. And so she has this giant burial complex. And so when we talk about, you know, women doing great things, they didn't wait until the 20th century to start doing great things. They've been doing great things all throughout history. And so don't let anybody ever tell you that you can't do something awesome because you're a woman. And don't let anybody tell you that in order to do something awesome, you have to become Pharaoh or build all kinds of crazy things. Anything that you do for God, when you do it with all your might and you do it because you love the Lord, it's awesome. Whether that means you go and run a Fortune 500 business company, whether that means you do the great important work of being a wife and a mother and teaching your children about the Lord and how to love the Lord, whether you invent the next $20 billion idea, or whether you do anything. Do it for the Lord, and you're going to be doing something great. And do it to teach people about the things that are eternal, and you're going to be doing something that is more important and lasts longer than any monument that Hatshepsut ever built. So we're going to kind of end our talk about the pharaohs there. You can go and look up more about them if you want to, but these are the ones that are going to be on your exams, especially Pepi, the cute pharaoh. Go over this information. Make sure that you take good notes. If you have questions, make sure and email me your questions. And go ahead and get ready for next week. Next week we're going to be talking about World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. So that's going to include things like Korea and Vietnam. We didn't really get a chance to talk about the 20th century too much last semester, so we're going to kind of play catch up there with our time frame, and that'll set the stage for individuals that we're going to look at later. So next week, World War I, World War II, Cold War. Major events, 20th century, and so we'll be talking about those things next week. Remember, review the pharaohs, get the information that you need, because there's going to be a quiz next week, and the pharaohs will definitely be on it. They're definitely going to be on your test, and you're probably going to have an essay question about the lives of the pharaohs and how they're interrelated and connected to the events going on around them, and how the religion is shifting and changing. As far as Hatshepsut is concerned, the changing of the religion, you can see now they're being viewed as divine. They have this huge complex here. And it's interesting that Thutmose III, when Moses comes, says, "Hey, let my people go." That's the only period in history where the bricks, during Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, and Hatshepsut, that dynasty there, it's the only time where you have the bricks being built that the Bible talks about, being built manufactured by the Hebrew slaves. And it kind of gives us a backdrop for understanding Thutmose III, why he thinks he's so powerful, how wealthy he is, and those kinds of things, and how the story of Moses just fits exactly in line with history. The Bible and history always agree. And so we don't need to go searching for ways to make them disagree, because when we just look at the facts, what God has said and what has actually happened line up perfectly. So again, next week, remember, World War I, World War II, Cold War. See you guys then.